Good morning. We extend a warm welcome to all those attending this international seminar. The Ocean and Natural Laboratory, Visions and Challenges of Knowledge in the Territory, an activity organized within the framework of the Natural Laboratory Node Project of the North Central Ocean. We especially greet the authorities who are accompanying us. The Vice Deputy for Research and Technological Development, Rodrigo Sfeijasihi, Mr. Regional Ministerial Secretary of Science, Technology, Knowledge and Innovation, Dr. Ruber Moraga Mamani, also the Director of Public Policies of the University of the North, Mr. Arenas, and we also greet Dr. Jorge Soto Delgado, Seremi of the Ministry of Science, Technology, Knowledge and Innovation of the Central Microzone, who for health reasons was unable to join us. Also, we greet the audience that accompanies us through the Zoom platform and through the transmission of the YouTube channel of the Catholic University of the North. Today we have simultaneous interpretation. To activate this function, you can press the button located in the lower right corner of the screen with the globe icon and select the language of your choice. You can also adjust the volume of the interpretation and the speakers. The objective of this meeting is to discuss the challenges and lessons learned from inter- and transdisciplinary work on the ocean to strengthen the scientific activity and its impact on the territories. To begin this activity, from the Ministry of Science, Technology, Knowledge and Innovation, we have here to greet you today the Minister of this ministry, Aysén Echeverría Escudero, and they send us their greetings through the following video. The natural laboratories are a huge opportunity for development in the science and the technology. So ANID created these laboratories of natural resources. And today we are here because of this laboratory of the north part of the Chile. The ocean have some great characteristics that are very important for us. I was in Chañaral, in Aceituno, knowing the whales, and it's really amazing to see all the potential for investigation, for science, and possibly the responses for all the questions that we have as humankind. And that's why we wish you an excellent seminar that you can have deep conversations, and we are going to be very attentive to listen to those results and listen to your recommendations so we can know how we can take advantage of these laboratories that we have now. We thank the words of the Deputy Dean of Elvira, Mrs. Echeverría Escudero, and now we give you the greeting of our Vice Rector of the University of the North, Elvira Poblete. She couldn't be here with us today. Good morning. Our university, Catholic University of the North, is an institution that has a very important public mission from its creation 67 years ago. We have certain values as an institution, which are liberty, justice, and truth. And this node, or to release this node, these laboratories for the North Oceans, is part of what we do as an institution. This node has been led by a professor of our university, Marcelo Olivares, and the idea of these nodes is to create and boost everything that ANID has been working for. Chile is a state that has a lot of maritime territory, more sea than we have land, so it is our responsibility to look at the sea and not work without it in our minds. So the idea that we have to develop this node is precisely to know the activity that we have in the oceans and to take advantage of that activity, that life that we have in the sea for a sustainable development respecting the environment. We also thank everyone that is here today and we greet you. This has been organized by the University of the North and another 8 institutions that are part of this node. And we also greet the minister and everyone else that is involved here from the Ministry of Science, Technology, Knowledge and Innovation. Good luck to you all and thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your words, Dr. Elvira Badilla Pobleta. To continue, I leave you with the Ceremi of Science, Technology, Knowledge and Innovation of the North Macrozone, Dr. Ruben Moraga Mamani. It is a pleasure to be here in this seminar. I would like to greet you all and of course to talk about the importance that this natural laboratory has, that is very important for us as a country, for this particular piece of land that is limited by the mountain range and the sea. And the ocean is very important for us because today, in the situation that we are living, this crisis, this global crisis regarding the climate change, the greenhouse gases, and the temperatures, and beyond that scientific aspect, we would like to talk about the development of the different territories and also how the transdisciplinary work has to be led in the social part, in the politics and the economic part and everything that is related to society. We, the academy, has to have this look, this new look to see the challenges that the territories have. And I had to participate in many of these activities, so it's been really important for our view how we face these challenges. So thank you very much for the work that you have been doing. Thank you for inviting me and for participating. We thank the Ceremi of Science, Technology, Knowledge and Innovation of the Northern Macrozone, Dr. Ruben Moraga Mamani. To begin this international seminar, we welcome Professor Dr. Esther Turnhout from the University of Twente, lead author of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, who has developed her work focused on environmental governance with a focus on the intersection of science, policy, and social values. We invite Dr. Turnhout to begin her presentation.
Okay, so I think you can all see my screen now and hear me properly. I wish to thank the organizers for inviting me. This is a really exciting opportunity to learn about your approach, which sounds like a wonderful initiative. Laboratories are known for being the opposite of natural. Laboratories are very artificial, often with standardized conditions. So to use the term laboratory and associate it with nature, with all its unpredictability and complexity and challenges, really sounds like a worthwhile endeavor and quite an exciting initiative to try and link knowledge to action, and link knowledge to action not just on land, but to do this for the ocean. Adds, of course, a level of complexity and uncertainty that is quite unprecedented. I think as someone who's done most of her work in terrestrial and social systems, I think the amount of things that we don't know about the ocean is for me difficult to comprehend, and I think that's true for many. So the uncertainty, the risks potentially as well, and the complexity of human actors and non-human actors makes this a truly exciting initiative. And I'd love to learn more about this. So I start my talk by saying something that is probably well known to many of you, that if science wants to make a change, a positive change in governance, in biodiversity, in social values, we cannot just, as science, be in the ivory tower, providing objective knowledge and then expecting society to act rationally for a number of reasons. I mean, it's clear that whatever decisions are made, they cannot be attributed to either the contribution of knowledge or the lack of knowledge. And pretending that that's the case actually can easily become a source of paralysis for policymakers, because if they don't know what to do, or if they don't act, they can always blame science. So it's also our responsibility to change that way of thinking. Another reason is that science itself is not free of values. And while this might sound uncomfortable for many, I think we can also accept that values are important. And the good debate, the good discussion to have about this is what values should inform science, and what values should inform policy and societal decision making. So the idea is that since science is actually not separate from policy and society, because we're all human beings, we should also be more explicit in creating good connections. So while it's no longer a real question whether science engages with policy and society, the important question now is how? How do we do this in a way that fosters both knowledge production and the conservation of our natural environment in ways that are just and equitable? So one of the answers as to how do we engage is by means of participation. That we have seen a participatory turn in environmental science, in lots of issues where knowledge and policy practice come together, and often in cases where there's a controversy, we turn to participation as a solution. In order to address the context in which science and technology are applied in ways that address the demands of those societal and policy actors, and to organize good relations between science, policy, and society. So when you look at participation from a critical perspective, what you often see is that they come with terms. So a value of participation is that it creates inclusion, that it creates diversity, or even that it creates pluralism. Now, to my mind, there's an important distinction between inclusion and diversity on one hand, and pluralism on the other. And I can explain this by going to a little bit of the history of participation, and also an analysis of what has happened since the participatory turn in science and technology. Because when you look at the literature on participation in science, under terms like action research, transdisciplinarity, co-production, you actually see that a lot of these projects and initiatives are not fully successful. And from our literature review, we identify 3 problems. First of all, is that very often these initiatives ignore power. They are framed in a way that, we need all the stakeholders on board and all the scientific perspectives. We need all the solutions all the tools in the toolbox that can help progress. Now, what happens if you do that and you ignore power relations is that very easily you reproduce existing inequalities. So if you don't pay attention, the scientific experts in this participatory process will end up as those that have knowledge, and the participants in the process will end up as those that need knowledge and that have values or interests, but they don't have knowledge. So this common pattern that is behind the linear model that we need to leave behind gets reproduced because these participatory processes are organized without full consideration that these actors that come into these processes are not equal. They come with different power relations. Another way in which these power relations can play out is that at a certain moment there will be pressure in the participatory process to get to a conclusion, to come to consensus or to integrate different forms of knowledge. This very often can come at the expense of some of the diverse voices that you wanted to include, because they might not agree with the majority, because they have a perspective that is not so easy to integrate. So ironically or paradoxically, processes that aim to be inclusive and diverse end up being quite undiverse. So they've eaten up, as I tried to illustrate with the Pac-Man figure in the slide, they've eaten up this diversity. You started with 5 people and they're all different colors, and you end up with only one that is rather bigger than the others, and they've all become yellow. So in a way, that is what often happens in participatory processes that do not recognize that they start with uneven power relations. And then a third one, I'll skip the other one for now because I'll come back to it in a later slide. The third one is that co-production processes start as isolated experiments or pilots. And that this is excellent because it gives the opportunity to try something new. And I can imagine that a natural laboratory is a bit like that. It can be seen as a local experiment, as a safe place to try to do something new. But then, of course, it's important to recognize that if these innovations or processes remain detached from wider political or institutional actors and contexts, they stay local. So they're not transformative. A pilot is a pilot. People like pilots because institutional change is not possible, because that's not seen as desirable or feasible. And at a certain moment, of course, for transformation, for co-production and process of collaboration to be truly transformative, at a certain moment, they will have to scale up. So for these reasons, the ambitions that these processes start with do not always succeed fully. I'm not ready to say that they're complete failures, because sometimes the consensus that comes out is productive and it's a step in the right direction, but they're often not able to meet their own ambitions. They end up less diverse as how they started, and they end up less transformative than the original intentions. So one reason why these problems are actually quite persistent, because what I just told you now about co-production has been part of the body of literature on participatory governance, participatory development projects since, well, I don't know actually, but since forever, basically. So we know that this is what happens if you don't pay attention to power. But when you add scientists to the mix and you create collaborations that include experts, you add a special dimension to these issues, which makes these problems even more difficult to to get out of. And this is because what is underappreciated is that there is always framing. So framing is inevitable and important in science, and that is often not fully appreciated. Clearly, facts do not speak for themselves, but facts and values entwine. It frames about what the problem is, or what the ecosystem is, or what counts as important biodiversity. All of these things are not necessarily true objective facts, because nature doesn't tell us. They are frames, they are stories in a way. And these frames are not innocent. They also define the solution space. If in your frame rare species are important, the solution space becomes restricted to what do we do with rare species. And they also define what is relevant knowledge. We need to understand what species are rare and why. So certain frames within the sciences are quite dominant. The social sciences are much less dominant, for example, as the natural sciences. And also within the natural sciences and within the social sciences, you have differences in power. And these inequities mean inequities between knowledge systems, paradigms, disciplines, mean different access to authority, to funding, to the amount of people working on these different paradigms. And then it becomes very easy that certain frames gain dominance over others. And within nature and biodiversity domains, there's clearly a dominant interpretation of what nature is. There's a dominant interpretation of what biodiversity is and how you measure and govern that biodiversity. And that can easily crowd out other perspectives. And it's well known that other worldviews, other knowledge systems, ordinary citizens have very different perspectives on what nature is, how they relate to nature, what you need to know about nature, how do you take care of nature. All of this makes a lot of difference if you look at different disciplines and also non-scientific forms of expertise. So these patterns of dominance have political implications. They have implications for who sits at the table as an expert. And they have implications for what we do, how we govern, how we manage nature. So they also come with justice and ethical consequences. So, and this is what I was asked to say a little bit about the politics of knowledge. And this is what I mean with the politics of knowledge, that certain forms of framing environmental problems, environmental knowledge, environmental characteristics, and environmental solutions are all combined in certain powerful frames. So what you see is that what we know about nature and how we govern nature are tightly connected, as this quote tries to explain, and is almost a circular relation. And in another publication, I've called this circular relation measurementality. And I've illustrated that with the emergence of the theme of the concept of ecosystem services in biodiversity science, where you actually see that the term ecosystem services became quite dominant and powerful. As a result of it, it started to shape what kinds of biodiversity science got funded. This increasingly had to be about ecosystem services. And that knowledge also created a policy focus on the governance, not of species necessarily or ordinary perspectives on nature, but on the governance of the effective and efficient delivery of these ecosystem services. Now, with this increased policy attention on these ecosystem services, this again led then to a push in science funding, focusing more on this concept at the expense of other concepts. And you see that circularity is then self-reinforcing. And what you also see is that when you think about effective relations between knowledge production and knowledge use, either by society or by policy, you might understand on the basis of this story that effective relations are those relations that take place within a single understanding or a single frame of what this nature is that we need to produce knowledge about in order to inform policy. So the idea of effective knowledge action connections immediately comes with this risk, because the more effective these relations are, the higher the chances are that you're working in a very narrow definition of the problem. So actually, just knowledge action relations that are just and inclusive and diverse, there's a real tension with this idea that these connections should be effective. In having justice and equity and inclusion as part of the mix might mean that we have to create quite messy and ineffective, or perhaps uncomfortable and conflict-ridden connections. Those might be better even though they are not effective. So I think I'm going to skip this quickly. So in the book that we wrote, where we more or less take readers from a chapter about philosophy of science and the concept of framing and the risks of framing, to, well, how do you operate as a scientist given that this is the case? Our book ends in chapter 9 with an explanation of different roles of experts. Experts can be in a servicing role, where they work also in a singular frame, but they answer the questions of a policymaker. Experts can be in an advocating role. This is often not seen as positive, but in an advocating role, scientists work from their own frame, and they provide the knowledge and the policy recommendations that fits with their own frame. But of course, from our analysis about the importance of true inclusion and diversity in fostering connections between knowledge and action that are just, we suggest that experts in these processes, and we hope that this is helpful for the shaping of your natural laboratories, that they take a diversifying role. And a diversifying role would mean that as an expert in such a participatory process, you try to identify all the relevant frames and also the marginalized frames, and that you try to disrupt problematic dominance of certain frames over others. And you create a safe space for these diverse frames to discuss and dialogue, to generate the knowledge that fits with these diverse frames, and to also generate options that fit with these diverse frames. So in this role of diversifying, we suggest that it is possible to prevent the risks of co-production that I've talked about, and to truly open up to diverse perspectives, while still creating linkages between knowledge and action that work, but they're not universal. They'll be very context specific, and they'll vary across depending on who the experts are and who the participants are in this process. So how do you do this well? We suggest that you continuously question these frames. So what are we working from? What are our values? What do we think the problem is? What do we think the ecosystem is? What is the ocean? What does it consist of? What matters? And all the time question whether that frame is actually justifiable. What is excluded? Is that a problem? How can we open up? Which frames are perhaps a threat to diversity and cannot be excluded? It cannot be included. this is also a constant deliberation. So you may see this slide and think, okay, that's not effective. And indeed, I see a real tension between trying to prioritize effectiveness. I see a real risk that threatens justice, inclusion, and diversity. And I'll leave it at that. So thank you very much.
Agradecemos a la doctora Esther Tornhout por su
We thank Dr. Esther Turnhout for her interesting presentation. And before we continue, we invite you to leave your questions and or comments in the Zoom chat or through the YouTube transmission. And after the presentations, we will leave some time to answer your questions and comments. Now we invite the director of Node Natural Laboratory, Central Northern Ocean, from the Institute of Public Policies, Marcelo Olivares Arenas, who is going to tell us about the advances of the process leader by the node in the coasts of Atacama, Coquimbo, and Valparaiso. Welcome, Marcelo. Thank you, Joanna. Maybe you can tell me if everything's okay with the presentation. Can you see it? Yes. Great. Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you, Professor Turnhout, for your presentation. We've learned a lot about the ideas of the professor, and we've also seen in the work that we've done how these tensions appear or these different frames when we try to speak about science and knowledge in the territories. We are this set of institutions, a relatively big group who's been working on this based on the ideas that have emerged from the different natural laboratories, the Chilean natural laboratories, as an opportunity to take science closer to technology in a way that it allows it to project in an international way, and also that it produces benefits in the territories where these natural singularities are located. In that framework and within the work of the node, we seek to understand which are these opportunities and also to have the opportunity to contribute to decentralization of the scientific activity, and as articulators of or expanders, we seek collaboration among different institutions and people, right? With the objective of boosting the transdisciplinary approach in topics that sometimes are complex in the different territories, and sometimes they can't be approached only from one discipline. So with that framework, the objective has been, of course, identifying which these natural laboratories are, which are their singularities regarding the Central Northern Ocean, which is where we are focused, with the objective of setting a route that allows us to see how to strengthen this scientific activity with a focus also in the territories in a way that's multi-sectorial, and it allows participation, and it's also sustainable. And our first mission in that sense was, well, to identify which are the natural laboratories. This is a framework that we had been talking for a while regarding the implementation of certain projects, and this has led us to very passionate discussions with the other nodes in the country, right? To understand or to see what we understand when we talk about a laboratory. What do we mean by this concept? What does it involve? And specifically regarding the characteristics or singularities, biogeographic and physical of the territories, they allowed us to identify under this framework three ideas of natural laboratories. One has to do with the surgeon systems that exist in the central northern zone of the country. This happens in around 1% of the ocean, and it represents a great percentage of the fishing industry, and in the coast of the central northern zone, it is present, and particularly it's present in a permanent way in the southern part of the Coquimbo Bay, which is Punta Lengua de Vacas. So in this zone, we have an element associated to these processes that are constantly being studied and that have an important potential to contribute to development in the Chilean coasts. The second natural laboratory, or the second geographical space that we've identified as such in this zone, corresponds to the Humboldt archipelago. This has a set of singularity and physical and chemical singularities that are very particular and that give it an environmental diversity and a dynamism which provides connectivity among the different systems, and it creates the conditions for it to be a hotspot of biodiversity, or what we've called it a hotspot of biodiversity because of its characteristics. But not only it is a singular place from a point of view of its biodiversity, it also has an economical importance for people who work there and for the country as well. So it has a great value associated to the human capital. And we also can see a series of uses that are coming together in this territory because a series of stakeholders with certain power or access are present. And this presents important challenges, not only for conservation, but also for the development of this territory. And something very important and something that makes this very singular or special is that this is a place that's relatively close to urban areas. So it allows the access conditions for scientific work, and that allows, to show you what I'm talking about, I have this this small video precisely for of the work of Maritza, who is going to be with us in a while. This is the archipelago zone. We have important studies going on there that are being developed regarding biodiversity and sea mammals. However, or at the same time, right, this unique place is a place that is being threatened with things associated with the certain mining activities that happen in the coast. And we also have other conflicts, social, environmental conflicts, and these are also interacting there and presenting challenges for us as working with these natural laboratories. And the third singularities that we've identified have to do with the base systems in this central northern zone, and we've identified them through conversations and along with the scientific team. There is a singularity associated with the set of bays that are present in these areas. So that we can identify these base systems, we establish certain criteria. For example, the existence of upwelling coastal points. And we have more than 100 kilometers that allowed us to observe certain phenomena that happens there between or among these bays, something that's really important not only for productivity of the coastal zones, but also to understand the different scenarios of possible change in the future. So we identified 3 base systems. Besides, in these base systems, it happens that there are protected sea areas and also anthropic pressures in Atacama through the south, and also in the northern part of the bay. We have a national park there, Pan de Azúcar. In Coquimbo, we also have a coastal upwelling to Punta de Vaca up to the north in Punta de Toros. And in the case of Valparaíso, we have this point in Punta Cueromilla up until what would be Los Molles. So having identified the singularities of the central northern ocean, we focused in exercise or activity that allowed us to understand or move forward in the comprehension of what the visions of these territories are from a scientific point of view regarding the secondary information database. But we are also interested in these participatory projects to identify what's the vision for the future regarding these spaces, along with them, how science could then collaborate to these joint visions that we developed through the workshops. As I was saying at the beginning, we have these open activities where we allow participation. We had an heterogeneous participation, and in each of the workshops, we had participation of the academia, of the local governments, and also from civil society. So having identified those natural laboratories, we got to understand a little bit more about the different visions so that we could establish this framework or to have a direction on where to go. We can't show the results of one of the each workshops, but for example, we made an exercise in collaboration with the F project that has to do with the coastal authorities, and it included a local vision along with the communities, and we can highlight the positioning of this place for its biodiversity, considering local governances that allow cohesion and joint work among the different coastal parts. And we also talked about public policies and planning, that it had those are things that have to be joined. Also, we talked about protecting the environment, and of course we want to contribute to the development by strengthening the circular economy, but also protecting the environment and its identity and culture, because we have there important presence of the tango population. And also within the work we've done, we found we encountered an image we wanted to build a media image we wanted to appear in Google, for example. So we had a media of more than 1,000 views in Google search. So it gives us an idea of how important this is. And there is an important contrast there, because while communities have a vision, a quite clear vision, independently of we prefer it or not, there's a media perception that is really focused, or that has been focused in big projects that seek to be there in that zone. So there's an important contrast regarding the frameworks where discussions are. And in the case of the base systems, we have a vision that we can see it here on the right. We have several words associated with researchers, with the research that we've done. We have for example, in the Atacama Bay, it has to do with the research of sacrifice zones, as we call it in Chile, in the zone of Chañaral as well, regarding new achieving new discoveries or paleontological discoveries. And also we want to achieve sustainable aquaculture, and regarding also the repopulation of species. And this also has to do with illegal fishing in the northern part of the country. In the case of the bay system of Coquimbo, we have a future vision regarding to put together certain uses and the charge capacity of these places. That's a concept that we use a lot, but it can have different meanings or different assessments if you want to. And also the role in this part of the territory, tourism has a role here with support of science, the evaluation of certain fragile ecosystems, and to be allowed to count on public services that are there to be focused on controlling illegal fishing and also to take care of certain processes, for example, reusing water and what happens with the processes of the water that goes into the sea. And finally, in the case of the elements, the most present elements that when we talk about a base system towards the future in the region of Valparaiso, the focus was in protecting the beaches and in the coastal area, and also tourism, this protection associated with the building projects happening there that is associated to the value of this, so the the resources, and also to recover the sacrificed areas of that region. Thus, later we created the identification of certain gaps and how technology could be useful in that sense. And in a general way, we've rescued, so to speak, the strong ideas that here you can see them divided into the different regions, Atacama, Coquimbo, and Valparaiso. But what we present also can apply to the different, to all of the region. It's just that the emphasis kind of changes a little bit. For example, to strengthen basic science, to get to know what is there in the Atacama coast, also the biodiversity and the local ecosystems, to understand, to set baselines regarding the natural resources. In the case of Coquimbo, we also talk a lot about the need to implement articulation measures to create public policies based on evidence with a great concern of the territorial planning, which extends as well to the case of Valparaiso, where we also have the need to experiment or to move forward towards the remediation of risk zones. Having identified then which the singularities were of these spaces or of the oceans in these three regions, identifying the upwelling zones, the Humboldt archipelago, and everything that allows us to observe the connectivity and different phenomena in the bay, we move forward to develop actions and proposals to project these efforts from science and technology. We have a vision in these natural laboratories and from the ministry and we seek to decentralize the scientific activity, and at the same time that the territories are the one who contribute with their visions and where the efforts should be done in that sense. In a very brief way, because each laboratory has its own actions, we've identified in general terms, we've grouped this around three areas. One is research, development, and innovation, and also outreach. It may be more traditional, if you will. Another one that has to do with the learnings and capacity building, what we need to move forward in this research and development and outreach. And regarding the governance part that are interacting with the scientific activities or with the results and the influence that this could have. Regarding the future efforts of research and development and outreach within the different actors in each case, and in a common way, then the need to have baselines of biodiversity and environmental services is quite in line with what we've been discussing regarding the natural capital and the need to understand in time the evolution of and the health of those systems, and especially in Atacama and Coquimbo, to be able to count on baselines of seagrass meadows. We have an important loss of biodiversity there and of, of primary production from the seagrass, to be able to strengthen the outreach of the knowledge and the decision making around the ocean, focused on tools from science. So we have very creative ideas there, especially in Valparaiso, because we have the idea of making a national aquarium there that contributes to education and outreach. Also, certain topics appear about the need of having bathymetry in and modeling this singularity more precisely, in a more precise way, in such a way that we can make an integral characterization of bays, and we can constantly monitor them in time. And associated to that, we need to be able to count on with systems of observation that are present permanently, that allowed us to create an integrated management. And regarding repopulation and remediation, regarding participation in management areas, that's this is very important to artisanal fishermen, and it's something that's cross-cutting, and it has to do with also with giving value to the certain population, native population there. And regarding the building of capacities towards the future, we have to care about strengthening infrastructure and human capacities that allow observation, moderation, and the use of technology for or to observe the ocean, to promote. There are certain policy aspects that have to do with promoting the coast and political ruling projects from part of the local governments. We need to they need to understand the the ideas that we are pushing forward. Also, sustainable touristic development. These are capacities that need to be strengthened in the different territories. And lastly, and in a permanent way, we have the idea to begin soon to promote and strengthen circular economy around the northern central coast. And finally, in this summary, the most relevant elements that came up regarding norms and governance is to be able to have certain norms regarding illegal fishing, for example, to also identify points of there are needs of scientific knowledge that need to be included in the decision-making process, because we have a general opinion that science is necessary in the public policies, but it's not clear yet where or how. And also regarding also the norm, we need to care about the mining processes and strengthening public services with an oceanographic point of view. Those would be the results or the elements that can be helpful to strengthen science and technology with a focus on the territory. But we've also have learned other things, and I don't have much time left, but regarding experience, what we know is what the territory contributes to science. Sometimes it's clear for the communities, but sometimes it isn't clear what science could contribute back to the territories. So it's hard to establish the limits because of the complexity of the ocean, right? Because a natural laboratory, what is it's very dynamic thing, so it can be kind of complex. Besides, there are differences between the approach of a natural laboratory, but there are also other definitions that are political or regarding administration, so that could be different. The continuous observation of the ocean is key, and it's an important gap. Regarding when I was listening to Maritza, she said at the beginning she watched the certain mammals pass, and she couldn't monitor them, and she couldn't do much more from that observation. There's also the capacities are are not the same. So there are efforts to decentralize the scientific activity, and this should also pay attention to the differences between the different regions, and also the topics that I mentioned before: conservation, small-scale aquaculture, to face social environmental problems. And also what we've found during these exercises, many of the actions have to do not necessarily with the creation of new knowledge, but with the effect that it has on the territorial planet, the impact assessment, the capacity of charge that the ecosystem have, and the contributions that we can do with a local focus. So we have an interest in developing greater knowledge, but also we have an interest in understanding how this knowledge has an influence or can help the local aspirations. And in that sense, and I'm going to finish now, to be able to strengthen this articulation role in which we've been working on, it's necessary to gather the local visions, as we said many times already, but also there are political and institutional challenges. People not necessarily are familiarized with the technology ministry. It's a new ministry, and besides, the local authorities do have more power locally. So the central we need to keep working on the decentralization projects. Also, the funding is important to be able to finance projects in a medium term space of time, to be able to orient or challenges or this idea of visions that we talk about as a way to have a route to where to address our projects. And finally, people are the ones who develop this. They are the teams that work there. They are the ones worried about the needs of the people, but also with clear ideas on their action and work, like their research and other results. And finally, the political leadership from the ministry and the articulation with the public institutions and local governments. That's really important in a way, as a way to boost or promote in an open way. That's important to strengthen science, knowledge, and innovation. We see that in that sense, the natural laboratories require to strengthen in these six aspects. We have a space for natural laboratories there associated to promote articulation of the different actors, to bond global and local challenges, to put knowledge in the for the local communities, also to orient our efforts local in a local way and in a national way, also to boost the impact of science in the territory, and also to identify problems and gaps that allow science and its impact to be on time. And to finish, I would like to very briefly to thank this team effort that I've been leading along with Maritza and the different institutions that are part of the node, and also the executive team. And we've been working on these different tasks. Thank you very much. And we are going to be there attending to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Marcelo, for telling us about the different actions that through the laboratory have been working to strengthen the activity, the scientific activity regarding the oceans. Now to continue, we're going to welcome Dr. Tarbal Erhani, which comes from the Federal University of Bahia, and he's also the coordinator of the National Institution of Science and Technology in Interdisciplinary Studies and Transdisciplinary Studies in Technology and Ecology in Brazil. He's going to share his experience from elements and challenges to activate the knowledge through sustainability. Welcome, Professor. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Good. I'm going to speak in English.
For the invitation to discuss some issues that substantially interests me in connection to this relevant experience of the natural labs in Chile. So obviously there are many challenges at the science policy interface, but I'll focus on one challenge that has to do with an epistemological issue related to these problems, the science policy interface. The question I'd like to begin with is how can we deal with the trade-off between generality and situatedness in using scientific knowledge in practice? So if you think that when we use knowledge to deal with problems, these problems are always situated. And so we need a realism and a situated character to deal with knowledge in practice. On the other hand, scientific research usually produces knowledge at different levels of generality because we wish to have explanatory power, predictive power, heuristic power that comes strongly when we model at higher levels of generality. This means we have a problem when we try to bring our knowledge from scientific circles into practice because in our work as we model phenomena, we abstract away a number of specific features that the phenomena have in situated circumstances in order to gain more explanatory and predictive power. But when we want to use this knowledge in practice, we need these situated aspects that we took it out through the modeling strategy, through decontextualizing research strategies that are most common in scientific research. These strategies come with a number of values. Esther Turnhout told us about the relationship between research strategies, framing, and values. I will not explore this now because what I want to look at is what happens when you try to increase the situated character and then the applicability of the knowledge we produce in scientific research. Usually, we think of this as a translation process. So we talk about translational science, and we try to see how we can use more strategies of research that are more sensitive to context to try to build a translation into a reality from this knowledge that had abstracted away a number of the specific features of real phenomena, and then to put back these aspects when we try to apply this knowledge in reality. One problem, however, is that translational science is often equated with evidence-based practices. And evidence-based practices, at first, there are no problem with that, but they run a risk. They run a risk of exactly taking the unidirectional model in which we produce knowledge and evidence in our academic communities, and then we try to translate this into practice. So if we only think of making practice evidence-based, we may, in fact, be reinforcing this unidirectional model. And that's a problem because this model has generated a lot of drawbacks in the relation between science and policymaking and science in other communities. This has been part of the reason, the motivation why people have tried to engage then other social actors in the translation process, in the movement from the knowledge we gain in academic circles into practical issues. But if we are trying then to make this kind of translation with other social actors engaged, and then you try to move from social engagement into even co-production of knowledge, then what we are talking about? We're talking about making a dialogical process that involves scientists from several academic communities, alongside with practitioners' knowledge, like environmental technicians or local teachers, with local knowledge from social movements, from communities, like fishing communities or indigenous communities, and also knowledge of other stakeholders that do not belong in these two groups, practitioners and communities, but are still affected by the decision-making that's made using scientific knowledge. But these several groups, they come to the process with a diversity of cognitive constructions, a diversity of epistemological criteria to judge what's knowledge and what's not knowledge, with a diversity of ontologies. They simply if you think of different categories and entities and processes existing in the natural world, and they come obviously with different systems of values. Then, if we are not careful about how we deal with all this diversity, of this epistemic, ontological value diversity, position in different power relations, position in different social positionalities, which affect how these social actors will interact with each other. If we're not very careful about how to deal with the complexity of this process, the political situatedness of this process, and the fact that we can preach very beautiful words and ask for participation, for transdisciplinary, for co-production, co-management, and a lot of these beautiful words. But if we don't think carefully about the inequalities and powers and in issues related to power between these different social actors, all these beautiful words can simply be a gospel that we preach, but in practice, they don't mean anything different than simply using evidence and using the authority of science to make decisions despite all different perspectives from all these social actors. So I'd like to share today with you some ideas about these issues that come on one hand from philosophical work that we have been doing on issues like intercultural translation, knowledge integration, things like this, and also from our experience in empirical action research in artisanal fishing communities in Brazil, and also indigenous communities also in Brazil. So often when we talk about bringing several stakeholders together, communities, practitioners, with the academic communities, we end up thinking about something that we call integration of knowledge. Integration of knowledge, for instance, has been strongly advocated in conservation science. And at first, there was nothing wrong, it seems, in thinking about integrating knowledge. But the problem is, if we try to integrate knowledge, say, between indigenous communities and the scientific community, we from the scientific communities, we have much more power to force our own positions into the collaborative process than indigenous communities. So in the end, what's presented as integration of knowledge is often facing a lot of epistemic injustices, in the sense that often when academics are integrating knowledge, what they're doing is treating other knowledge systems as source of data. And I can integrate, for instance, knowledge for indigenous groups in pharmaceutical science, but I'll only take the empirical data about the plants they use, for instance, as medicines, and the possibility of extracting active principles and making new medicines. I can talk about looking at the knowledge of, let's say, indigenous hunter people in the Amazon, but I'll only look at what they talk to me about the behavior of animals and plant diversity and things like this. And we don't really talk about several other entities and processes and properties they recognize in the natural world, which are integral to their knowledge systems. We don't talk, for instance, about the masters of animals, which are disembodied entities that they treat as natural, but influence all the relations between animals, plants, and human beings in the forest. So we take a look at what looks more convenient from the perspective of our own epistemic assumptions, our own ontological assumptions, our own value assumptions in the knowledge systems of others, but we simply neglect what doesn't feel so comfortable with our assumptions. And then what we are doing is something that we can call epistemic injustice, because we enter into contact with the knowledge system of other peoples, other groups, other communities, and we simply cut what interests us, treat as data for our own research, and ignores a lot of what they think about the world. So are they really participating in an integration knowledge process, or are they being treated as sources of data? Data that's only seen from our own perspective. So these are things that we should worry about if we really want to move into participatory processes of knowledge co-production. Let me tell briefly a story. It's a story about indigenous youth that comes to researchers and talk to researchers. Look, these people from ecology, they really like coming here to the community and they talk to us, they participate in our activities, but you know, they don't really take us seriously. And why was the indigenous youth saying that? Because they say, look, when we talk about plants, animals, and a lot of other things, they are very interested. But when we start talking about Catumbaya, which is the master of animals for this particular indigenous group, which are the Pataxó from Bahia, then they are not interested anymore. So these people who really know what's going on in the interface between research and their indigenous group, we should remember that Linda Tuhiwa Smith says that research is one of the dirtiest words for many indigenous communities around the world that have been harmed by research, that don't like the idea of having research on them. So some indigenous communities like this one I'm mentioning, they are really aware of what's going on in the relationship between science and their communities. And they are simply telling, well, you should take us seriously. And taking us seriously means that you should also look at those aspects of our worldview, those aspects of our knowledge, those aspects of our judgments about knowledge that don't fit comfortably into your own worldview. And this means that this kind of integration of knowledge that becomes very popular has important limitations, and perhaps we need to search for other ways of dialogue between knowledge systems. This becomes a central issue when we need to think of an interface between scientific communities and other communities. We have been thinking a lot about that here, because we have exactly tried to do what Esther told about it. Think about our frames. Criticize our framing. Look at the limitations. Try to overcome the limitation, just to find more limitations on the way forward. But we need to keep our frames continuously under a critical lens. Our frames about what we consider to be knowledge, our frames about what we consider to be in the world, our frames about the values we see about knowledge and the values we see about nature and things like that. And we have been thinking about some tools that we can use to try to make our own positionality, our own frames, continuously under criticism. So I'll briefly talk about some of these tools. One tool is an epistemic virtue that a thinker from India, a feminist thinker from India, Vrinda Dalmia, calls relational humility. And in relational humility, let me tell you how Vrinda Dalmia frames the idea, which is better than I would frame. So she writes that someone who has relational humility can realize that the more we realize what we know, the more we are aware of how much more we do not, but need to know. And along with this comes a realization that there are others who do know what we do not. So this epistemic virtue, which I should say is relatively rare among academic communities, has two parts. One part is that I ascribe to myself ignorance. I know there are things I don't know that I need to know. But I also ascribe to others knowledge, in the sense that it's not about self-knowledge only, that there are things I don't know, and if I try by myself or I try among my equals, my peers in the academic communities, I'll learn that. I need to learn from others. And this is a kind of epistemic virtue that engages us with others, but engages us with others for epistemic reasons, because we need to learn about knowledge that they have and we don't have. So I advanced the idea that if we manage to develop, as researchers, relational humility, we would be in a better position to do something that, frankly, we are not very good at, taking others' perspectives on the world really seriously, even when they disagree with our own perspectives about the world. When we start from virtues like that, we can think of different models of bringing knowledge systems together in a participatory process. A model that I particularly like is a model proposed by Maria Tengo and colleagues in reflections about how the process of knowledge dialogue in the IPBS and the CBD has been happening along the years. So it's a model about successful collaborations between knowledge systems and has 5 steps. One step is how we mobilize the knowledge of the different groups involved in the participatory process. The second is how we translate knowledge across these different groups. The third one is how we negotiate the divergences and convergences and conflicts across the knowledge contributions that different groups bring. Then we think about how we synthesize knowledge, and the way the word synthesize is used in this framework is different from the word integrate, because synthesizing something means that you can keep the disagreements in the synthesis. The synthesis is not finding a completely consensual perspective by all the participants, because this will be really hard when the participants work with a diversity of cognitive constructs, a diversity of epistemology, a diversity of ontologies and values. Then synthesizing is finding where we agree, where we disagree, but clarifying where we disagree. And the disagreements, once clarified, are part of the synthesis. And finally, try to apply these ideas. So I will go through these steps that I just summarized in a slower way, trying to bring 2 ideas that come from our philosophical research. One's about translation. So what exactly means when we try to translate across cultures, across knowledge systems, and how can we learn from difference, even when the difference is rather radical, through these translation processes. And the other is a theory and methodology that David Ludwig from Wageningen, Netherlands, and myself, we have been developing. It's the partial overlaps methodology. So beginning by mobilizing, the issue about mobilizing is first in getting the participants into the process. And we need to think carefully about who are the legitimate participants. So for instance, when we talk about indigenous communities, sometimes people bring for panels of collaboration researchers who work with indigenous communities or researchers who work with fishing communities. Well, we are not legitimate representatives of these communities. So we need to bring representatives of the communities that truly represent the communities. And then we need to think about how we bring these people coming from very different backgrounds, very different experiences, and they can come into a process that they can articulate knowledge in a form that can be shared with others. And this is in itself is quite a task, because usually, for instance, in our work, field work, in the beginning, we are 8 years working the same fishing communities. In the beginning, we do what academics usually do. We meet and we talk and we talk and we talk, and then we try to get something from talking with each other. Well, this doesn't work. Then we need to develop arts-based methods, where using arts as a conveyor, as a mediator, we could make people speak from their perspective in a way that's not systematized in the same way that we systematize knowledge in our academic world. We had to work with storytelling. And storytelling is a different way of systematizing knowledge that we use much less in our communities than in many other communities. Just 2 examples, we need to find ways that people can speak to each other when they are coming from very different backgrounds. And people have been silenced. People have been silenced by years of oppression, by centuries of oppression. So it's very difficult to make people speak. Then we need to think about what's the kind of affirmative environment that we build, that people start to speak out and really goes out of the silence that have been forced to be. If we don't do that, we do participatory process that are in fact pseudo-participatory process that legitimize our own perspective while we say, well, we heard for the others, but the others didn't have much to say. Well, they truly didn't have much to say. Or the way we frame their participation, make them feel, well, here's a place to be silent again, as we have been silenced in many places along our experience. We have these people here we are being silenced again, so we don't speak. And then we use this kind of participatory process as legitimizing of initiatives that are not really legitimized because people have been silenced. So how we frame this kind of mobilization of knowledge and participation is quite crucial. When we mobilize people, then we need to think, well, how can we translate across the different perspectives? And translation is a tricky thing, because every language and every knowledge system has a systems of categories underlying them. What are the categories of reality that structure reality into events, into objects, into properties, into processes? And these categorical schemes, they don't match with each other perfectly. There are no one-to-one translation between the several categories. So anytime I am translating from one knowledge system, let's say, to another, I'm not exactly finding words to say the same thing that, let's say, an indigenous person is saying. If I assume I find the same words, then I'm silencing the indigenous person, because I'm assuming that what I say is what they're saying, but they're not saying exactly what I'm saying, because the categorical schemes are different. So the first step is, I think, is something that the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro called controlled equivocation. We should realize that all translation processes are equivocation processes, not in the sense of mistakes, in the sense of error, but in the sense of multivocality. Even when we translate and find words to say the same words, we are saying different things. So are always multiple voices there. The next thing then is, well, why we engage in translation then, if we keep saying different things? Well, I only believe in translation process that are truly experienced and shared along long stretches of time, that people, not only they come together and translate things and talk about how the knowledge can be synthesized, but they experience each other's knowledge and experiences in a shared way, so that in the end, we may find words that we say together, but these words are not the words that we were saying before. To continue with my example, if I eventually find new words to say together with an indigenous person, I'm not saying what I was saying in the beginning of the process. He or she is not saying what they were saying, but we may find new things to say together. And that's an important learning processes. So what new things we can think that were unthinkable before when we engage in this kind of shared participation and shared translation process. One important kind of knowledge that can come from that is that I can learn because I am challenged by the ontological frames, the epistemological frames, and the value frames of the other. And as I am challenged, and I will never go negative, and I never become the other, but I can start to think things that I couldn't think because my assumptions were not under scrutiny, and my assumptions could come into scrutiny because the perspective of the other, from their positionality, illuminates blind spots in my own ontological commitments, in my own epistemic commitments, in my own value commitments. So what I'm talking about, and I'll stop talking about intercultural translation now, is that intercultural translation, which is needed, I think, for participatory process, is a dialogical process that creates new meanings and allow for learning from the other through challenging our own conceptual and practical toolbox. And this is, for me, very important when we talk about mobilizing the other knowledge so that we can come to negotiate. We can come to understand, well, where we disagree, where we agree. And this is where this methodology we have been developing called partial overlaps comes. It's the idea that, look, when we work with different knowledge systems, we shouldn't suppose they are scientific. There are several tests in ethnobiology, for instance, that says, well, indigenous knowledge conforms the basic scientific principles that we use in academia. That's very dangerous. That's very dangerous because we are putting a very big lens on agreements, and we may be silenced in these agreements. On the other hand, sometimes people say, well, different knowledge systems are incommensurable. We can never translate across them. Well, if it is that, we can never really create any true participatory process because we need to try to find ways to understand each other. So the partial overlaps try to put the process in between these extremes. So let's try to find in the cognitive dimension, in the epistemological dimension, the ontological dimension, the value dimension, where we can agree. Thinking that where we agree, all the things I talked about intercultural translation are in the middle, because our agreements are produced by a translation process. But we can find spaces where we think, well, here we agree. And that's important, because mutual understanding and shared experience will be much easier if people begin from things they think that they agree with each other. And then once we have this background of shared ideas, we can have an affirmative environment to then engage with our differences in a situation where people feel safe to talk about the differences. And then it's where we can learn from the other, learn from the differences. The big problem, however, is that if we don't think politically about the relation between the stakeholders, then these affirmative environments can never be built, because we will be always engaged in power relations and positionalities through which we oppress the participants of the process. Why we are saying very beautiful words about participation, engagement, co-production, and have a sequence of oppression processes that in the end, the synthesis that we build may have some properties that are problematic. I'll mention only two. I look at the synthesis, and the academic perspectives are overrepresented, and the other perspectives are underrepresented. So this is an evidence that power inequalities have played a role in shaping the synthesis. Another problem is that we make a synthesis that's usable for us, but not usable for the others. We can make syntheses which are so dependent on our scientific ways of reasoning, on our scientific vocabulary, on our background knowledge that we can use. But others to use, they would have to pass through scientific education to be able to use. So this seems very problematic. I think to finish with a word of hope, we have been learning how to make participatory process that work better. We should not take the golden rule of participation as something that we need to put into action in the first steps of our process, or even when we walk the beat in the process, because it's very hard. It's very hard to feel all the golden rules of true participation. But we should think about the demands of true participation as a kind of regulatory ideal that makes us look at the horizon. So that's where I'm going. I will make the steps I can make now under my limitations, under the limitations of the whole process, under the limitation of our institutions, of our evaluation process that reward us. But we try to make the steps, the small they are, in the right direction. So I think the right way of thinking about the demands of the literature on participation, which frankly, when I read the first time, I said, well, I can't do that. And then I had to realize two things: that I would fail, and failure was a part of the process. And second, that if my failures had at least some small steps in the direction of what I believe is true participation, the process is worth doing. One final comment is that we have a lot of precaution. The idea about precaution appeared in the chat here. We have to be full of precaution, because our failures to realize true participation, they eventually may come into policy making and make a number of rules and approaches that come into, let's say, fishing communities, indigenous communities. And if we are not very careful about what's going on, and we don't care for the other stakeholders, our failures can translate into things that put harm to them and make a lot of risks to them. So I think we who are in the positions of more power, we who are privileged, we need to realize how privileged we are to be more careful about the other communities with whom we interact, who are less privileged than us. And this would bring me back into relational humility And so by closing this circle, I'll stop at here.
Agradecemos al doctor Charbel por su presentación y damos
We thank
inicio.
Dr. Charbel for his presentation, and we begin the conversation panel where will be with us Dr. Maritza Sepúlveda, professor of the Faculty of Sciences of University of Valparaiso and co-director of the Ocean Node. Mrs. Zoila Bustamante, President of the National Confederation of Artisanal Fishermen of Chile, Dr. Stefan Gelsic, Director of the Millennium Institute in Coastal Social Ecology, SECOS, of the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. We invite all of you who have questions to make them in the Zoom chat or through the transmission of the YouTube channel of the Universidad Católica del Norte. I leave with you Dr. Maritza, who will be in charge of moderating this space. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here in this seminar. Well, as I was introduced, my name is Maritza Sepúlveda. I'm an academic in the Valparaiso University and also co-director of this project, node of the Central Northern Ocean. I'm very happy to be here in this discussion. I've been seeing a series of questions, very interesting and relevant questions that have appeared on the chat. And after our panelists are presented, we are going to begin with this round of questions by discussing along with them and also with the presenters all of these interesting interventions that have appeared during the talk. Thank you. I would like to invite then Mrs. Zoila Bustamante. Maybe she wants to introduce herself, and then Stefan as well. Well, good afternoon to everybody. Everybody who's here, good afternoon to Mrs. Maritza and also Stefan. It's nice to meet you again. I want to thank you for the invitation to this important panel and note, and I wanted to tell you that I'm quite nervous because of the previous presentations, but I'm going to try to do my best so that we can do the best. So thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm the president of the National Confederation of Artisanal Fishermen of Chile. I'm assistant of the fishing. I live in Los Muermos, Los Lagos, and I'm also in charge of the administration of the cove and also of women fisher who fish here. And that for in the meantime, and I'm going to try to answer all the questions the best that I can. Thank you. Stefan? Hi, good afternoon. My name is Stefan Gelsit. I'm a professor of the Pontificia Universidad Católica. I'm director, as you said, of the Institute, Millennium Institute in Coastal Social Ecology. I work a lot with these interactions between social sciences and ecologic sciences. I'm as nervous as Zoila because I think that we do things right. I believe in co-management, and I think that moving forward in processes of co-production, keeping the respective cautions, that's an important advance in sustainability. Thank you very much and welcome, Mrs. Zoila, Stefan. So before we begin with the questions, with the more specific questions, I think that it would be very important for everybody to get to know your opinion or your general view regarding especially what we've been discussing, right? These interactions between science, community, the dialogue that happens there, the interests of the communities of participating, of being part, the co-management, Stefan, that you mentioned. Maybe you could briefly give us your own vision before we begin with the questions. I would appreciate it very much. I don't know who wants to begin. Mrs. Zoila, maybe? Well, I would like that the professor would have begun. Okay, so then I start. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Well, Maritza, well, today I feel like between the presentations, there are two topics, right? One that has more to do with the cautions, the necessary cautions that we have to have around participatory processes, also co-production, also co-management was a word that was mentioned, and another topic that has more to do with the work that you have done. So they are a little different. So I'm going to answer first about my vision of what you were asking regarding the first thing. Well, I think that at least here in Chile, there have been important processes of learning regarding many of the things that you pointed out and with which I agree. It's not that I disagree with what Charvel says or what Esther said. We agree, and those are important cautions, and those are points or ideas that we need to have as or guidelines. What I think is that it's really important that we learn through these processes and that they don't paralyze us, because during many years we were paralyzed and we didn't even speak about multiple systems of knowledge. Independently that or apart that from today, we work with traditional knowledge, sometimes with ancestral knowledge from an Occidental point of view. So these tensions are created, but we need to learn there and work along with these tensions. That's what I think, at least. Maybe we can get closer to sustainability from science, only from science, whether it's social sciences, natural sciences. This is a very personal opinion. We haven't been able, and I don't think that we are going to be able of reaching the sustainability of coasts and oceans. It is within these interactions and this sharing of knowledge, and of course respecting these power problems or or the processes that Charvel mentioned, methodologies, how to approach, how to improve the way in which we do this. But I think that it is through this integration of knowledges that we can get to innovative measures to manage the ocean. If we do not integrate those knowledge, that knowledge with all of that dimension, I take one thought. Of course, we agree that in co-production we need to recognize that it's something political. It's clearly something that has to do a lot with politics, because it's oriented towards solving sustainability problems, which are problems that have to do with the human behavior, also with or also with biophysical variables. And I am going to end with this. In Chile, we have some of these examples, important examples in co-management that began with something from the scientific knowledge trying to help artisanal fishermen, and now those powers are more balanced, and maybe Soila can talk about this. Now we have an important role in knowledge production, how they themselves have been innovating. And with this I am going to finish. We need to be also careful. I like recommendations, but we need to be careful to not maybe we don't have to build something if we don't know how these historical processes have been, because that's the way in which we are going to move forward in a global level, right? Around having these, let's call them good practices, or these
Muchas gracias, Estefan.
that we have to take into consideration in the processes. Miss.
There are many things that I wrote from the previous presentations, and there are some things that I worry about. But as Professor Stefan said, we have to talk from the knowledge, and what's better that the fishermen, the knowledge that fishermen have. I think I was 5 years old when I first got into a boat with my father, so I learned to respect the sea. I wasn't afraid. I was respectful of the sea and any kind of sea, because the ocean is composed of many places, but it goes beyond that. it goes beyond having or not the scientific knowledge. You also have to have the ancestral knowledge. We are a population of fishermen and we have to share. And of course, the people that talked before, you have to share with us what we live, what we see every day, because it is good to have the scientific knowledge to tell us what we have to do, but our knowledge has to be taken into account because this is in situ knowledge, is what we learn at the sea, how we face reality, how we see what is going on today, all the changes in the sea, the different smells, the different colors, the winds, the climate change. The climate has changed so much that in places where we used to have snow, we have sunshine. So this was not present on the previous talks, and I know, I believe that we have to share this with the scientific persons that we're talking here today, with the scientific people that is working in on these notes, as Professor, the second person that spoke said, that if you have real contact with the communities, the node is going to be something real and it's going to be useful and it's not going to be just something on paper. But if you're not in contact with reality, this is going to be another document that we as people are not going to even know that exists. And some other thing that the First Lady said, she posed a question and I wrote it down. She said, I wrote it. What are the oceans for us? What is for us? For us, the oceans are life. This is the life of us. For fishermen, the ocean is our life. Thank you both. Thank you for your intervention. Now, I have another question from the participants, and it is related to this idea of many times the community sees these scientists as people that come to gather data, they write the reports, and that does not come back to the communities. If we are talking about areas that have problems, real environmental problems, we feel certain resistance from the communities to deliver or to give us the information. So from the point of view of Stefan, when he talked about this more scientific approach to the communities, but Mrs. Zoila has another point of view, how we can go together to the same place? How can we have a better communication between science and the communities so everything that you said can flow in a better way and with the urgency that we have, because we are facing this climate change and this is very important to face right now. So what is the strategy to go forward in this dialogue?
Well, well, I have a very particular vision, but I think that, well, taking advantage of what gathered us here today, which are these nodes in which you've been working on for a while now, I think that everything has to do with starting from the beginning with the dialogue, not including it at the end once things have already been agreed upon. I think some of the principles that all of the other authors exposed, those are key principles, right? Those are principles, very important principles of participation, around how the retribution is, how the different types of knowledge are leveled. I think that fulfilling with some of these characteristics that we've heard today, and especially start from the beginning, not like get there with a project which is already finished, which already has been approved, to seek for knowledge. This implies a few things, and I'm going to talk from a scientific point of view now because Mrs. Soila has the other part, but it's something that I missed from the presentation of Marcelo, is that the project that you present is already built fundamentally from biophysics of the biophysics of the system, right? And I saw the lines of research, etc. And I don't see lines of research that have to do with social sciences. Well, I don't know. The political science, well, it is a science, right? So if we want to for that to be part of what you prioritized, well, that there's a lack of research in political sciences. Where are these other, not even type of knowledge? We are working on certain areas. I miss that, because if we really want to include all of these things, not only the different types of knowledge are the ones that we want to include, and the other speakers mentioned them, but also within science, right? It's not only biophysical science, the other areas of science, and also that Charbel mentioned arts, human sciences. And if we are talking about the ocean as a natural laboratory, well, we need to consider biophysical sciences. There also could be social sciences, arts, even. Those contribute around the questions of that natural laboratory, right? So we move forward from that perspective. Of course, that at least to me, it's important, this thing about how can we include these different types of knowledge. And there I really appreciate from these side notes that you gave us, that some of the presenters gave us.
Señora Zoila. Sí, bueno, ¿cómo avanzar?
Yes. How can we move forward in our dialogue? I think that sometimes it's really complicated, but to move forward together has to do with what I said at the beginning, to see the reality and to set a dialogue, to speak to the different actors, to see the realities of the people that live at the sea. I'm in the north, and I'm talking about the people that live in the south, but at the first stage, the areas of management were started in the north, and we had to start living a new reality. We didn't have the liberty or take what we wanted from the sea. We had to start to recover the things from the sea, and we learned to be cautious on the way. So we have to keep in mind now that there are certain resources that are at peril today, and we have to recover them. And we now have different responsibilities, a different management. We have certain dates that we have to follow, and we didn't know about that before. We didn't know that there was a time, a season, for instance, to take something from the sea. I don't know what word to use to not to offend anyone. It's not that we are not smart enough, but we have the capacity, the ability to work together with the people that set the rules, and on the second place with the one that wants to teach us something. To set rules and to teach are different things. But we lost the ability to work together and learn from one another. We have to take the possibilities that we have at this moment. How can we go into a place where we can work, where we can get production, where it can be, we live from this. The best areas are the areas of management. These are the protected areas. We as fishermen have the knowledge to take care of them and to make them productive. And they were given to us when they were empty. So we were the ones that had to recover them and learn this is the bread that we have. This is the place where we are going to work. And that led us to have a dialogue together. We can have a dialogue from there. We can learn from one another and from our realities. I am convinced that my reality is not the same reality as in the practice. What happens to us in the as in our world of fishermen is not the same that you discuss inside an office looking through the window at the sea. The wind, for instance, changes 7 times during the night. It's not one wave that we have to face. There are 5, for instance. So you have to know that to have that real knowledge that is not scientific. We have to know all of this to make something that is good for everyone, and not a pebble on the shoe for one's in disadvantage from the others. Thank you, Miss Zoila. We have lived this with the communities. We have heard the complaints, how we make our decisions inside the walls without taking into account. It's not something you know. There is not learning. There is not an interchange knowledge into from the communities and the academy. Okay, and Stefan said we have to start sharing from the beginning. How do we do this? I have lived this and I know what it is, and we have never seen interest from the communities. When the science go to those places and we try to speak, you always hear the same people speaking, and the rest is not participating. So we saw that with the note when we organized certain workshops, we didn't get all the participation that we wanted. We take a long time to learn, and at the end, just at the end of the activities, we see that some people said, I didn't have the chance to participate. And we don't know yet how to involve everyone from the beginning. I would like to maybe, if there's anyone that can comment on this before we go to the questions of the rest of the participants, please. I'm going to say something very short. I haven't really thought about this, but I think that projects like this node, give us opportunities, or they should give us some opportunities that other kind of projects don't have. We cannot assume that the projects can improve sustainability and work with different types of knowledge with certain actors and not others have the same time cycles as the time cycles of the funding of sciences. So we have these cycles of times that are really different, and we have to be clear and said, you know what, projects like this that are thought for 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, maybe on the year 5, we can improve a little bit the participation, and we can involve all the voices that are outside. All the voices that are outside maybe are going to take 5, 10 years to be integrated. So I think this kind of projects, the advantage that we have is that we can change that cycles of time. It's really difficult to have a participatory process if you have just 3 years. These processes of co-production are not going to be successful in 3 years. In my experience, it takes at least 15 years. Mrs. Soila knows some of the communities where we have been working. It takes 15 years to start going somewhere to have this process of co-production. So that was my thought. We have to start convincing the people that want to invest in sustainability that maybe we have to start thinking about these frameworks of time or time constraints that we have.
I don't know if Soila wants to say something, or if not, I would like to give the microphone to the attendants. Maybe Dr. Esther, you want to answer some of.
Yes, thank you. And I think so. Thank you for sharing your insights. And I love the notion of the ocean is life, and I think that is already completely makes clear that human beings and non-humans and also non-living entities need to be treated in their relationships to each other. Also, and not one of them as objects of knowledge collection or data gatherers. I wanted to come in on integration a little bit, and I think that when we consider power inequalities in the environmental sciences, it is one of my experiences in interdisciplinary fora is that these unequal power relations between disciplines in the environmental sciences get reproduced in these interdisciplinary settings. So I'm not against knowledge integration as a principle, but I haven't seen it done well ever. So that makes me sort of careful about the term and what it legitimizes. So what we often, in my experience, mean with integration is that we treat knowledge as separate units or things that we can extract from the place that knowledge comes from. So the knowledge itself becomes a discrete thing. We have frameworks that actually are predetermined, that fit with a predetermined problem framing of what is sustainability and what's the problem, what's the ecological problem of a certain area. So very often you will see either social ecological systems, integrative frameworks, which have a slot for the social science knowledge about institutions. They have a slot for the biodiversity knowledge about species. They have a slot about the values, perhaps. All of that is predetermined. And of course, that leads actually to new monodisciplinary knowledge around this concept of social ecological systems. And so the success of interdisciplinary integration is the production of monodisciplinary commensurated forms of knowledge that are extracted from the context that knowledge was generated from. And the other example I would give is within IPBES, which uses a kind of a DIPSIR framework. I don't know if this means anything to you, but that framework consists is like a causal model, and the causal model has drivers, causes of change. These drivers translate into pressures, the proximate causes that leads to changes in the state of an ecosystem, that leads to impacts, so a certain trend in species as a result of these changes in state, which then are followed, hopefully, by societal responses that might also address those drivers. So the IPBES assessments are organized in that principle. It's all pre-framed. None of this is co-produced. So as a social scientist, you can imagine that you're in the responses slot. Social sciences are not included in the assessment of the state of the ecosystem. Social sciences are not included in many of these other slots. So again, what you see is the disciplining of diversity for the sake of what is then called interdisciplinary integration. So it is a reduction of diversity. And when you would then question these frameworks, as a social scientist saying, I don't think that the world works through a causal model, or I don't think that that nature and human nature relationships can be captured in a social ecological systems framework. You think that biodiversity is itself social and political. When you raise these kinds of questions, you're actually excluded from interdisciplinary collaboration. So my experience with knowledge integration has seen this as actually a disciplining exercise that tames, reduces diversity, and it excludes the diversity that it doesn't like.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Esther, for sharing your knowledge with and experience with us. And para finalizar, por honor al tiempo también, quisiera...
Now, to honor the time, I don't know if Dr. Tarver.
Yeah, briefly. First of all, I also mentioned what Zoila told about the perception of the ocean as life from the fisherman or fisherwoman. I have many years learning with fishermen and fisherwomen about the ocean and the rivers. And I was just mentioned to begin a very beautiful saying by a fisherman from community work, because we're talking about mangrove destruction. He said, well, the problem is if the mangrove is destroyed, I am destroyed because I am the mangrove. And that's not just words. That's the embedded identity of a fisherman, a fisherwoman, and several other communities who have the same kind of sense of place they have. And I'll talk a bit about distrust. So why communities sometimes feel distrust in relation to academic communities? Well, there have been problems, yeah? Expropriation of knowledge is a problem. That there's a lot of intellectual property problems around the world from expropriation of knowledge from traditional communities. Justification of inequalities is something that science has several times played a role in. So they have good reasons. They have good reasons to be suspicious. And how can we then create this process of participation? Well, we have been trying a number of things which have been working. One thing is get the people from the communities into the research as participants. But not as participants that gather data, like in some kinds of citizen science. Participants that define what will be investigated. So now we are just, next week, we'll go to the field, to the fishing community. We want to begin a participatory monitoring process of something. What? We don't know. What they want to monitor participatorily? Crabs? Other kind of shellfish? Fish? Fish in the open sea, fish in the coastal sea, fish in the rivers. We'll decide together. Because if I go there and say, well, that's the most important thing to do here is to monitor fish. Well, that's very top down, yeah? And usually we do this in academic research, not because necessarily we are bad people. I'll leave open that some people are bad people, but not necessarily. It's because we have been trained like that. If I ask my student to write a project, your research goal will be defined along the first month or the first year in the field with the fishermen and fisherwomen. The students get very nervous because all the pressures for us will go with our very clear research questions, but they close the door for the participation. So one thing is this: open up the process of research more and live up with these uncertainties, live up with the complexities, because if I wouldn't like to have the complexity and uncertainties, I'll remain in my lab writing my papers and not getting involved with community issues. They are messy. Work with communities is messy. That's the first thing that we should realize. It's not because communities are especially messy, because human beings are messy. If we work with human beings, always you have a lot of uncertainty, a lot of complexity. That's just natural. Another thing is talk transparently about the research all the time. Explain over and over and over and over why we are there. Are we really legitimate to be there? Do you like them to be there? Also, think about return. So they give us access to their knowledge, a precious things. They give us access to their time. They need their time to livelihood. They're giving a lot of assets to us. What to give back? Then we need to give return. But how we define return? Dialoguing with them. they should participate in deciding what's returned. Otherwise, it's all again is a top-down process where I define what kind of return I will give. The problem is that sometimes the community wants return we cannot give. Then what we do? Dialogue about it. Well, you know, we can do that because we don't have the competence, we don't have the means, we don't have the power. But that's a transparent, ongoing dialogue process. And finally, I think everyone who works in communities, coordinates a lab, who works in community, needs a code of ethics. And this code of ethics has to be very wary about what's responsible research that we do in communities. I will give just one example to finish. It's we have, for instance, a moratorium of data in our code of ethics in the lab. This means that if in any time with the community, we go into some data, we get some data in relation to them, that touches a sensitive issue, let's say a medicinal plant, where we find a use for a different disease that plant has never been used, and this can be expropriated for research. Then what we do, we publish the paper without the data on that plant. That's the moratorium. And then there is an ethical dilemma here, because it's not good that I publish a paper hiding part of the data. But then we see what's the worst. I think the worst is not that I lack a line in a table in my paper. The worst that my paper opens a door for knowledge that's property of other people to be expropriated. So if we find something like that, what to do? We don't publish the data. Then we go into the nucleus of technological innovation of the university and see, well, we have this problem. How can we guarantee the rights of this community? And then we need to go into the legal process to guarantee rights. And then once, several years later, we ask the editor of the journal to put a erratum to the paper, an extra line on the table that was not there. Very strange in terms of scientific publishing. Yeah, it is. It is. But you know, it's not a perfect word. But I think we need to put in the balance and say, well, I think I'm not harming incredibly badly the scientific community for the lack of some lines in a table, but I'm maybe harming the community very badly. And I like just to make a small comment on a comment on the chat about indigenismo as an ideology. Well, I don't like the word ideology. It's too confused, it's too messy, it means too many things. So ideology, I think, is a word I don't use. But I use value outlooks. So indigenism has a value outlook that goes to the defense of the rights, the knowledge, the livelihoods of the indigenous people that have been colonized. Well, true. But isn't the same true of academic sciences? Academic science has own value outlooks. So it's not about we have no value outlooks. They have value outlooks. Then we should be careful about them. Yes, you should. Yes, you should be careful about ourselves because we have our own value outlooks. Then the big discussion is how these value outlooks conflict, get together. And I think one of the worst things that ever have been taught to the scientific community is that science is value-free enterprise. That's bad, because someone who thinks that a human activity is value-free has values that are either undeclared luggage, which is really bad, or knows very well which values they have, but you are disguising them. I think we need to educate a generation of scientists that we have values, we should think about them, criticize them, make them transparent, at least in some situations. I'm just making this comment because there have been some works recently saying about bad consequences of scientists who are transparent about their values in any situation. In political situations, perhaps if you are the one with the open values in the table, you may be the only one in that table with the open values. So we should be smarter than that. So it's not only be with our values open everywhere, but we should think about when to have them open, in what circumstance. I can say clearly, with the communities I work with, we work with in our lab, our values should be open. This I have no doubt about it. I don't want my values should be open when I'm talking with technicians for the government or politicians. No, I don't want. So it's this kind of qualified answer we need to do about transparency, I think. But If I think science is value-free, not even the question about it appears. And that's really bad, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Charbel. Para finalizar esta discusión quisiera dejar...
To end the discussion, I would like to leave Marcelo. Maybe he would like to share some closing words. Marcelo, please. Thank you, Maritza. Thank you very much to the panel of the speakers for your presentations. To me, it's really satisfying to hear this discussion from the exercise that we've been doing, because as Stefan was saying before, not all projects have to approach the same problem. And this project, this initiative has been an opportunity that other spaces don't give us. Maybe in the framework of the institution, that's the one who's financing the sciences in Chile. So I think that has been a very valuable process. And it's been great to have been understanding how to include these inequalities or these different visions in the process. In the case, the specific case of the Central Northern Ocean, we have a gap with the social sciences, and the reason why it doesn't appear in these figures that I showed, it's because precisely the research that has been done in the past, and that's not necessarily the one that we are going to need in the future. And when we look at the problems and visions in the territories, those are undoubtedly complex problems around property, around resources, around water. So it's let's hope that in the future we can include social sciences, human sciences in these conversations, and that they allowed us to visualize the inequities. And that would be it, Maritza, to finish. Thank you very much, Marcelo. Well, thank you also to our panelists, Zoila, Stefan, to the speakers, and all the people here present that have posed a lot of interesting questions. Now we are going to finish this part of the discussion, and I leave you with Joanna to finish the activity. Thank you, Maritza. To end, we welcome our director of UCN, Dr. Rodrigo Sfeir Yasigi, who is going to give us some words to close this international seminar. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to especially thank the interesting presentations of our guests and panelists, ones that not only makes us reflect on this, but they also pose interesting challenges. The natural laboratories offer an open space to develop science, and the geographical characteristical and environmental characteristics of Chile allowed us to have a lot of them, each of them with their own particularities. I think that there are many advantages that natural laboratories provide us. One of the most important ones being giving space to the efforts in science, technology, knowledge, and innovation. This, without a doubt, will allow us to have a greater comprehension of our environment, improving our interrelations and creating the basis for its conservation. It is in that sense that the relationship between natural laboratories, knowledge, and public policies emerge strongly. This must lead us to have a system of public policies that has into consideration the territories, a better comprehension of our environment. We have to have a more focused public policies, giving real answers to the ecosystem requirements. Also, I think that this conception of natural laboratories must take us to include in the planning processes the different communities that are present in the territories. Our speakers already mentioned this. Knowledge that communities have regarding ecosystems is very important, and it can contribute to advance in science, and not only consider them so that they can perform certain minor activities when we need, for example, to move things from one place to another or to track some things. Only as an experience, I would like to tell you that yesterday I was in a meeting with more or less 20 presidents of indigenous communities of Chile, and one of the things that emerged in our conversation had to do with something that that was being announced for the day of tomorrow, that the president would launch the national policy of the Indian, and communities said, of lithium, I'm sorry. And the communities said, how is it possible that the president is going to launch that without even asking us? Because we are there, we know how lithium affects the ecosystem. We day to day see how it affects everything in our environment. So it was this kinds of disappointment because we keep on falling in the same bad practices. This was like something that Zoila was mentioning. We make or we create laws or norms that relate to the fishing industry or fishing sector without ever having even been on a beach, like looking it only from our windows, right? We've never been there. So we can move forward in science if we don't include our communities, if we do not consider them, and also taking into consideration these ancestral knowledge. Well, to finish, I would like to thank and congratulate the Institute of Public Policy of Universidad Católica del Norte de Coquimbo, not only for having organized this seminar, but also for leading this project of natural laboratories. I think it's a great initiative that makes us look at this with huge interest, how, beginning from this idea, we can keep on developing collaborative science in our country. Thank you very much. We thank the words from Dr. Diazigui. In the name of the Natural Laboratory, we thank the participation of Esther Turnhout, Dr. Charvel Elhani, Mrs. Zoila, and Dr. Helsich. Everybody who has been here with us today through the different platforms. For those of you who want to receive more information about the node, we invite you to follow us in our social media at Laboratorio Natural Oceano.cl or to follow our initiative in at Lab Natural Oceano in Instagram and Facebook. Good afternoon. Have a nice day.